Tonight, we drift back to a Europe long before modern medicine, before clean water flowed from taps, and before anyone truly understood what made people sick. If you love listing history while you are going to sleep, click that subscriber button. If you genuinely love what I'm doing, comment down below what country and time you are watching, so I will keep you up to date for more sleeping history. Let's continue. It was a world of candlelight and cold stone, a time when the air itself was suspected of carrying curses, when even the wealthiest nobles could not escape the reach of invisible death. But the plague I want to tell you about tonight is not the famous one you might think of. Not the Black Death of the 1300s. That one, most people remember. This one came later, and it crept through the centuries quietly, almost politely, and stayed for far longer. It was called by many names. Consumption, the White Death, phthisis. Today, we know it as tuberculosis. For over 100 years, it haunted Europe, a soft and lingering sickness, as ordinary as the morning fog, yet just as deadly. So, settle in, breathe slowly. Let's travel back to a world where people slept beside the dim glow of oil lamps, where coughing in the night might mean the slow approach of something no doctor could cure. Before the sickness came, Europe was a very different place. The year is somewhere around the early 1300s, before anyone had ever heard of the plague. Life moved slowly. The days smelled of wood smoke and bread, and people mostly cared about things like crops, weather, and making it through winter with all their fingers still attached. If you were alive then, your day probably began with the sound of a rooster, or your neighbor's rooster, because walls were thin, and sound carried across the whole village. You'd step outside, stretch, and take in a scene that hadn't really changed for hundreds of years. Fields, mud, animals, and the faint sound of a church bell somewhere nearby. That was your world. People didn't travel far. A journey of 10 miles might take an entire day and feel like an adventure. You probably didn't know what the next country looked like, and honestly, you didn't care. There were no maps on the wall or dreams of exotic vacations. Your world ended where the forest began. And yet, life had a rhythm to it. There was comfort in repetition, planting in spring, harvesting in autumn, eating stews thick with onions and turnips. The church calendar told you what day it was, and if you ever got confused, someone would remind you that it was Saint Whoever's Day again. Evenings were quiet after the sun went down. There wasn't much else to do except sit by the fire, listen to stories, or stare into the flames until your mind drifted somewhere between memory and dream. The sound of the wind outside your wooden door was constant, like the earth itself was breathing. There were fears, of course, not of germs or diseases. People didn't even know what those were, but of things like bad luck, witches, and that one guy down the road whose cow never got sick. You know, suspiciously healthy livestock. People worried about curses, omens, and whether the stars were in a bad mood still. In its own strange way, it was peaceful. Europe had seen wars, yes, small, messy ones, but life continued, even though it really wasn't. If you were a farmer, you were poor. If you were a lord, you were rich, and if you were a priest, you were both poor. And powerful, the spiritual Wi-Fi connection between heaven and earth. But no matter your status, death was always close. Not in a dramatic way, but as a quiet neighbor. People didn't expect to live long, maybe 40 years if you were lucky, or didn't catch something unpleasant from the well water. Babies often didn't make it past their first year, and even a bad tooth could end your story. Still, life went on, because that's what people do. They live, love, worry, argue, and laugh in the face of uncertainty. And there was laughter. Believe it or not, medieval people had a sense of humor. They told jokes about marriage, about monks who drank too much wine, and about noblemen who couldn't tell a chicken from a goose. It wasn't all doom and gloom. It was messy, human, and very alive. Now, imagine walking through a small medieval town. The air smells like hay, smoke, and whatever the baker's working on this morning. You pass stalls selling bread, cheese, candles, and maybe a few questionable potions made from special herbs. A man is playing a fiddle that's slightly out of tune. Children chase a dog through the crowd. It's noisy, alive, and surprisingly cozy, even if hygiene isn't exactly top tier. At night, torches flicker along narrow streets. You hear distant laughter from a tavern, the kind of laughter that grows louder as the ale runs low. People talk about the weather, about the local lord's taxes, or maybe a cousin who saw something strange in the woods. Nothing out of the ordinary, no one suspects that. Far away, a shadow is forming. that somewhere beyond the horizon, along trade roads and sea routes, something invisible is moving, a sickness that will change everything. But in this moment, here, before it begins, the world feels safe. It's a comfort built on not knowing what's coming, and maybe that's part of the charm. People could still believe that prayers, charms, and good behavior would protect them from misfortune. They didn't yet know that rats and fleas would soon become the most feared creatures on earth. In monasteries, monks copied books by hand, the slow heartbeat of medieval knowledge. In castles, nobles feasted under candlelight, never thinking the air itself might one day turn deadly. And in villages, mothers tucked children into straw beds, whispering the same blessings their mothers once whispered. Everything felt eternal, the seasons, the rituals, the rhythm of bells. And yet, history has a way of waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. If you were there, you might have noticed small things, rumors drifting in from travelers. A merchant from the east saying there was trouble along the trade routes, that people were falling ill in strange ways. But news traveled slowly, and besides, there were always rumors. Most people brushed it off, thinking, that's far away, it won't reach us. It's always far away, until it isn't. For now, though, life goes on. Candles glow in windows, the smell of stew fills the air. Someone tunes a lute while another complains about the weather, as people have always done. The wind rolls over the fields, carrying nothing more dangerous than the sound of distant laughter. The world is calm, and that calm, that stillness before the storm, is what makes what comes next so haunting. Because when the sickness finally arrives, it doesn't come with thunder or warning. It comes quietly, hidden in trade goods, tucked under fur pelts, carried by small, unseen travelers no one would ever suspect. But that's a story for the next chapter. For now, imagine yourself there, under a medieval sky, stars bright above, the faint scent of wood smoke in the air. The world is at peace, for the last time in a long while. So, take a breath, we're standing at the edge of history's darkest night. It began, as these things often do, with rumors, a whisper here, a worried merchant there. Talk of a sickness from faraway lands, strange, fast, and cruel. Most people in Europe, of course, didn't pay much attention. The East was another world. You might as well have said the moon was coughing. But traders, the few who actually traveled those great dusty roads, brought back stories. Stories of whole towns gone silent overnight, of caravans where no one made it to the next stop, and of a smell, thick, sweet, and wrong. These whispers came from the east, across the vast steppes and deserts, along the ancient routes that connected Europe to Asia, the Silk Road. It was along these same routes that spices, silk, and ideas traveled. Unfortunately, this time, it wasn't just silk that was hitching a ride. In the 1340s, the Mongol Empire was still powerful, connecting east and west in ways never seen before. Goods could move faster, armies could travel farther, and so could disease. The first great outbreak is believed to have started somewhere near the plains of Central Asia, maybe China, maybe deeper still. The truth is lost to time, but what isn't lost are the signs. The trade cities, bustling oases of color and sound, began to fall quiet. Merchants reported people dropping where they stood, animals lying dead beside their masters. Entire towns sealed themselves in, praying that closing the gates would keep death out. Spoiler, it didn't. Back in Europe, the talk sounded unbelievable. People told stories around tavern tables, half in awe, half in fear. Someone's cousin, had heard from a sailor that the Black Sea ports were cursed, ships arriving with fewer men than they left with, and those who did survive were half mad from what they'd seen. At first, it was just gossip, the kind of thing you'd hear and shrug off, sip your ale, and say, "That's dreadful," before changing the subject to the weather. But the rumors grew, from a sickness to a punishment, from a fever to a plague. And then came the story from Kaffa, a city on the Crimean coast. It was a Genoese trading post, a link between east and west, filled with sailors, merchants, and just the right amount of greed to keep business booming. In 1346, Kaffa was under siege by Mongol forces. The defenders held the walls bravely, but the attackers had a new problem. Their soldiers began to die, fast, one by one. Tents went quiet. The besiegers were being eaten from the inside by an invisible enemy. And then, according to one rather dramatic chronicler, the Mongols decided to fight back in a very unconventional way. They catapulted their dead over the walls. Yes, medieval biological warfare, a little horrifying, a little absurd, but reportedly true. The defenders, trapped inside the walls, could only watch as the bodies of plague victims came crashing down. The smell alone must have been unbearable. Before long, the sickness spread inside the city too. Ships fled Kaffa, desperate to escape, carrying survivors and rats across the Black Sea and into the ports of Europe. It's one of those moments in history where you can practically feel fate changing course. A single harbor, a few ships, a handful of fleas, and the world would never be the same again. But at that moment, back in Western Europe, no one knew what was coming. The whispers were still just that, whispers. If you lived in England, or France, or Germany, the East was so far away it might as well have been myth. The average person didn't think about trade routes or Mongol sieges. They thought about harvests, rents, and whether the miller was cheating them on flour again. Even the clergy, who loved a good apocalypse story, didn't see this one coming. But beneath the calm surface of medieval life, something was moving. Caravans still rolled along dusty roads. Cargo ships still docked in Mediterranean ports. Fleas still nestled in fur and grain sacks, unaware they were about to change history. By 1347, the first reports reached the Mediterranean. Sailors coughing blood in Messina, merchants dropping dead in the markets of Constantinople, entire crews dying at sea, ships drifting into harbor with no one left to steer them. People started to talk about the Black Sickness. No one knew what caused it, but everyone knew it was bad. And in true medieval fashion, people had theories. Some said it was bad air, miasma poison floating in the wind. Others said it was a punishment from God. Too many sins, too much pride, not enough prayer. A few suggested the stars had shifted into a dangerous alignment, releasing deadly energy. Science, as you might imagine, wasn't exactly winning the argument. Still, most people didn't panic yet. The disease was far away, something happening in strange cities across the sea. Even when a merchant ship arrived with sick men on board, the locals often ignored the warning signs. They'd unload the cargo, patch up the sails, maybe say a prayer, and get back to work. It is easy to be calm when you know what's about to happen. But the whisper was growing louder. From the harbors of the Black Sea, the sickness began to crawl west. Genoa, Venice, Marseille, and with each port it touched, the whispers turned to screams. Chronicles from the time describe it with a kind of horrified poetry, a sickness that ate men's flesh from within, a darkness that clung to the air. The truth was simpler. It was fleas, rats, and bacteria. But of course, no one knew that. All they saw were neighbors dying, cities locking their gates, and priests carrying more bodies than prayers. Still, if you were sitting in your little village hundreds of miles away, you might have heard the news and shrugged. That's dreadful, you'd say again, spooning stew into your mouth. But that's far away. You'd go to sleep that night, warm by the fire, never imagining that somewhere out there, a sailor was coughing into a wooden crate full of grain bound for your port, your town, your street. History doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just arrives, and soon, those whispers from the east would reach every corner of Europe. They would echo through every street, every church, every family. But for now, the whispers are still just noise on the wind, a merchant's tale, a rumor over ale, and a chill in the air that no one can explain. The storm is coming, but the world hasn't noticed yet, and the candles still burn bright. The bells still ring for mass, and people still laugh, still dance, still live, unaware that the century ahead will be haunted by a plague they will never forget. It's the year 1347. Somewhere along the blue-green coast of the Mediterranean, a handful of ships appear on the horizon. At first, the sight seems normal, another group of merchants returning from the east. But when the ships drift closer, the air around them feels wrong. The docks of Messina, in Sicily, are the first to see it. Dock workers stand squinting in the sunlight, waiting to unload cargo, when they notice something strange. No shouts from the deck, no laughter, no movement at all. When the first sailors stumble out, they look like walking ghosts, their skin darkened with spots, their bodies trembling. Some collapse before they even touch the pier. The harbor masters order the ships to leave, terrified that something unnatural is on board, but it's too late. The rats have already disembarked, and the fleas, well, they've already chosen new hosts. Within days, people in Messina begin to fall sick. Fever, headaches, vomiting. Then the swellings appear, large, dark lumps under the arms and between the legs, painful and filled with something no one wants to describe. The buboes, as they would later be called. And just like that, the Great Plague of Europe has arrived. It spreads faster than anyone can believe. Ships are refused at port, but they sneak in anyway, sailors desperate for food, for land, for anything that feels normal. But when they come ashore, they bring death with them. Genoa, Venice, Marseille, one by one, the great cities of the Mediterranean light up on the invisible map of contagion. There's no warning, siren, no declaration of emergency, and just coughing and silence. No one knows how it spreads. Some say the air itself is cursed, poisoned by the breath of the dying. Others think it travels through touch, through evil spirits, through the alignment of the stars. But no one suspects the real culprits, the humble black rat and the flea small, unseen, and absolutely everywhere. It's strange to think how something so tiny can bring down entire kingdoms. But that's history for you, always finding ways to make humans feel less important. In Venice, the sickness moves faster than gossip. Doctors, priests, and beggars all fall the same way. No amount of prayer or garlic or healing vapors does any good. And yes, garlic was a real treatment. People wore it around their necks like smelly jewelry, hoping it would keep away bad air. It didn't, but at least everyone smelled like an Italian kitchen. In a matter of weeks, whole neighborhoods are empty. The sound of crying echoes through narrow alleys, then fades into silence. Some families lock themselves inside their homes, boarding up doors and windows. Others flee into the countryside, thinking they can outrun it. Spoiler, they can't. The plague doesn't care about walls or distance. It travels wherever there's life and food and warmth. And Europe, in 1347, is full of all three. News spreads almost as fast as the sickness. Travelers tell of ships arriving in port with half their crew already dead, of city streets piled with bodies, carts rolling endlessly toward burning pits. But in many towns, life goes on, at least for a little while. People always hope it won't reach them. They keep working, keep trading, keep pretending. In Paris, rumors trickle in from the south. People whisper about the Black Death, though no one knows who named it that. In London, merchants argue about whether it's even real. Some say it's just a bad fever, others that it's foreign nonsense. Denial, as always, spreads faster than disease. Meanwhile, the sickness creeps inland, quiet and patient. The roads that once carried grain and silk now carry death. Every city it touches becomes a beacon of terror. Doctors try everything. They burn herbs, fumigate houses, and draw blood from the sick, convinced that releasing bad humors will balance the body. It doesn't, but it gives them something to do besides panic. The church, too, is overwhelmed. Priests perform last rites until they collapse themselves. Cemeteries overflow. At first, burials are solemn prayers, candles, dignity. But soon there are too many dead for ceremony. Bodies are thrown into pits, sprinkled with lime, covered quickly. It's not disrespect, it's desperation. Chroniclers describe the sight of men carrying their own dead, husbands lifting wives, mothers burying children, priests blessing corpses from a safe distance. The plague doesn't distinguish between rich and poor. Kings die in palaces, just as peasants die in barns. In some places, the social order itself begins to crumble. When your doctor is dead, your priest is dead, and half your neighbors are gone, rules start to feel optional. There are reports of people drinking, dancing, and laughing in the streets, a strange defiance, as if trying to prove they're still alive. Others turn inward, praying harder than ever, convinced the world is ending, and maybe, in a way, it is. Within a year, the plague has reached almost every corner of southern Europe. Ships bring it to Spain, to France, to the British Isles. Riders carry it to the mountains and across rivers. By 1348, it's unstoppable. For those who lived through it, it must have felt unreal, like a nightmare that refused to end. Each morning, the same dread. Each night, the same silence. And yet, there's something deeply human in how people responded. Even amid the horror, some still cared for the sick, risking their lives out of love, or faith, or sheer stubbornness. Neighbors shared food when no one else would. Monks nursed strangers they didn't even know. The world didn't just fall apart, it also held together, piece by fragile piece. In one letter from Florence, a man wrote that death is in the air, but life continues. As it must. It's a simple line, but it says everything. The plague had arrived, invisible, unstoppable, and merciless. But humanity hadn't vanished. It had just gone quiet for a while. If you stood on a hill overlooking a city then, you'd see smoke rising from countless fires, some cooking, some burning the dead. The wind would carry a heavy, bitter scent, and somewhere below, a child would still be laughing, not yet understanding what was happening. That's the strange thing about tragedy. It never stops life completely. Even in the worst moments, someone is still baking bread, still telling a story, still watching the sunset. And so the plague spreads on, carried not just by rats and fleas, but by ships and hope and denial. All the things that make humans human. By the time Europe realizes what it's facing, it's too late. The world they knew has already started to unravel. But this is only the beginning. The fear, the confusion, the desperate attempts to understand, all of that is still to come. For now, the arrival is complete, and the sickness has come ashore, and the quiet age of peace has ended. The century of shadows has begun. By 1348, the fear had a name, pestis, the pestilence. But names didn't help much. Europe didn't understand why it was dying. Everywhere you went, people agreed on one thing. The air had changed. It smelled different, felt heavier. Some said it had turned thick, poisoned by the rot of too many bodies. Others swore they could see death drifting in the sunlight. Tiny motes of doom floating just above the streets. In Florence, they said the scent of roses could suddenly turn into the stench of graves in London. Fog itself became suspicious. And so began the great age of bad air theory, or as scholars liked to call it, the miasma. If you could travel back to the 14th century, you'd see people trying to fight invisible air with visible effort. Everyone had their own trick. Doctors carried long canes. Not to poke the sick though. Sometimes they did, but to keep a safe distance. They wore strange bird-like masks filled with herbs, vinegar-soaked sponges, and crushed flowers. The idea was simple: breathe through nice-smelling things, and maybe death won't find you. Did it work? Not even a little, but they looked fantastic. Like gothic ducks of doom, ordinary people had their own strategies. Some burned sweet-smelling wood in their homes. Others carried posies of flowers under their noses. Hence the nursery rhyme that would come centuries later. Ring round the rosy. Some rich families hung ambergris and juniper berries around their rooms. Poorer folks just waved incense or old rags dipped in vinegar. Everyone believed the same thing. If you can smell it, you can stop it. And yet, the air remained heavy, and the death bells never stopped ringing. In the great cities, this invisible terror-shaped daily life markets thinned out. Priests walked the streets mumbling prayers. Doctors scribbled theories in trembling handwriting, desperate to make sense of it all. One physician in Paris wrote, "The heavens are unbalanced. The planets have conspired." He blamed the stars. Another swore it was the fault of corrupt vapors rising from the earth. A few whispered darker rumors that it wasn't the stars or the air, but people, foreigners, heretics, witches. Fear, when left unanswered, always looks for someone to blame. In Florence, one of the most famous witnesses, Giovanni Boccaccio, described the plague as something almost beyond words. He wrote that fathers abandoned sons, lovers left each other behind, and entire families vanished from one day to the next. But what terrified people most wasn't the sight of death. It was the feeling that the very world around them had turned hostile, that breathing itself was dangerous. Imagine trying to sleep in a house where the air feels cursed. You hold your breath without realizing it. You wonder if it's safer to exhale outside or under a blanket. That was life in plague-stricken Europe. The world didn't just look sick, it felt sick. In England, one writer claimed the air had grown so thick and foul that birds fell from the sky. That's probably an exaggeration, but hey, medieval writers weren't known for subtlety. In Paris, people covered their windows with cloth soaked in wine and herbs, believing it would filter the poison. In some places, bonfires were lit day and night, the smoke believed to purify the atmosphere. And so, the great cities glowed at night, not from celebration, but from panic. Fires in every street, candles in every window, prayers in every breath. It's a haunting image. Europe burning not from war, but from fear. There's something strangely touching about it all. This enormous effort to battle the unseen. They didn't know about bacteria or fleas or rats. All they had were their senses and their imagination. And when your world smells like decay, imagination becomes a powerful thing. In Venice, city leaders ordered strict rules. No one could enter without permission. Sick ships were to anchor offshore for 40 days, a practice that would later give us the word quarantine from the Italian quaranta, giorni, meaning 40 days. It was one of the first moments in history where people tried to contain disease through isolation. Not because they understood germs, but because they saw patterns. If you kept people apart, fewer died. Sometimes, guesses saved lives, and still, for every bit of logic, there was a mountain of superstition. Still, for every bit of logic, there was a mountain of superstition. Some believed music could cleanse the air, that singing or playing loud instruments could chase away corruption. So, in a few towns, musicians were hired to play in public squares. Imagine that, the sound of flutes and drums echoing through nearly empty streets, trying to fight death with melody. It didn't work either, but it must have sounded strangely hopeful, and amid all this confusion, one thing became clear. People started to look at the world differently. The idea that air itself could kill made everyone think about invisible forces. Maybe it wasn't just air. Maybe there were other unseen powers shaping life. God, sin, punishment, fate. The plague didn't just infect lungs, it infected thought. It blurred the lines between science and faith, between reason and fear. When no explanation fits, everything becomes possible. That SY, the period that followed the later 1300s, would be filled with strange movements. Processions of flagellants whipping themselves in the streets, desperate to earn divine forgiveness. Mystics claiming to see visions of angels or demons. Prophets shouting warnings that the end of days was near. And maybe, to them, it truly felt like the end. The sky seemed darker, and the seasons behaved oddly. Animals died for no reason. People began to believe the air itself had turned against them. And yet, in the quiet corners of cities, life kept pulsing. Some apothecaries stayed open, selling herbs, oils, and prayers in bottles. Some doctors refused to flee, moving from house to house, faces hidden behind those eerie beaked masks. Children, somehow, still found ways to laugh. There are accounts of them playing games with the flowers meant to ward off the sickness, making little crowns and pretending they were kings and queens of survival. It's one of the things that makes this story both tragic and beautiful. Even when people thought the very air was poison, they still built fires, still baked bread, still shared stories before bed. That's what humans do. We breathe in fear and exhale hope. By the end of 1348, half of some cities were gone. The miasma theory would continue for centuries, long after the plague had passed. But in those early days, when people looked up at the grey, heavy sky, they believed they were breathing in death itself. And in a way, they were. Not from the stars or bad vapors, but from a world too connected, too crowded, too alive. It was the first time Europe realized that being close, being human, could be dangerous. And yet, no one stopped breathing. They couldn't, because even in poisoned air, life finds a way to carry on. By the summer of 1348, the world had gone quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that hums in your bones. The kind that means something is terribly wrong. If you'd walked through Florence then, the jewel of Italy, proud and full of life, you'd have seen streets where grass had begun to grow through cracks in the stone. The markets that once overflowed with voices and laughter now echoed only with the flap of stray cloth and the scurry of rats. The city of light had become a city of whispers, and soon a city of the dead. It started, as always, in corners. A few empty houses here, a shuttered bakery there. People told themselves it was temporary, but soon whole neighborhoods vanished. One chronicler wrote that in some streets of Florence, no door was left unmarked by the sign of death. Families sealed themselves inside their homes, hoping the sickness would pass them by. Sometimes it did. Usually it didn't. Those who survived would emerge days later to find their world completely changed, quiet, colorless, hollow. Even the bells grew tired of ringing. In London, the plague arrived that same year, creeping up the Thames with the ships. The city was already crowded, already dirty, the perfect playground for death. Londoners woke each morning to the sound of carts rolling through the streets. Men with rough voices calling out, "Bring out your dead." At first, people watched from their windows in disbelief. Then, they began to drag bodies out themselves. By autumn, there weren't enough coffins. The dead were buried in mass pits, dozens at a time. Priests said prayers so quickly that the words began to lose meaning, not out of disrespect, but exhaustion. They couldn't keep up. The silence of the living became its own kind of sound. No more children's laughter, No more blacksmiths hammering at dawn, just the soft creak of carts and the rustle of wind between shuttered homes. You can almost imagine it, a candle burning low in a window, the faint scent of wax and sickness in the air, and somewhere a dog barking at nothing. Even nature seemed confused. Birds left the cities, cats disappeared, rats stayed, of course. They were having a grand time. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio, yes, the same man who would later write the Decameron, survived by escaping to the countryside. He wrote of how brother abandoned brother, and fathers left their sons, not from cruelty, but from fear. Touch could mean death, so love had to look like distance. Imagine that, not being able to comfort someone you love, because even a hug might kill you. It broke something deep inside society, the simple act of being near each other. In Venice, the canals became silent. The gondolas stopped moving. Only the bells of churches, slow, heavy, constant, marked the passing of time. And when the bells stopped, that was how people knew the priests were gone too. Some survivors described the city as haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories. The sound of laughter that wasn't there anymore. The smell of bread that no one was baking. Every place that was once crowded became sacred and terrifying. Even the pigeons at St. Mark's Square seemed lost, hopping between the footsteps of ghosts. Elsewhere, in Paris, the plague hit harder than anyone could record. Historians later estimated that as many as half the population vanished in months. That's not a statistic, that's erasure. The great University of Paris, the pride of Europe, fell nearly silent. Students gone, teachers gone, even the street vendors who sold hot wine to scholars were gone. Knowledge itself seemed to go into hiding, and yet, as strange as it sounds, life went on. In some cities, a strange normalcy emerged among survivors. People opened small taverns again, mostly to drink away memory. Merchants who'd lost everything began trading scraps, coins, and sometimes just stories. Humans, after all, are stubborn. We rebuild, even when the ground is still smoking. In Avignon, where the Pope had taken refuge, the smell of death grew so thick that officials ordered fires to burn non-stop around the palace. They even had herbs tossed into the flames to purify the air. One report claimed the Pope sat between two giant fires all day, not out of comfort, but out of fear. A man of God, hiding from the invisible. It's a striking image. Holy light turned defensive. The dead, of course, did not rest easily. Without enough priests or gravediggers, bodies often lay unburied for days. Some were piled in churches when the cemeteries overflowed. A writer in Siena recorded that the stench was so great that none could pass that way. Even the dogs refused to enter. The city's great cathedral, which had been under construction for decades, was abandoned halfway, stones still waiting to be placed. It's still unfinished to this day, a silent reminder of when the world stopped building. One of the strangest things people noticed was how fast the plague seemed to erase memory. When half of everyone you know is gone, what even counts as normal anymore? Children grew up with no parents, no teachers, no clear future. Whole villages disappeared from maps. In some regions, people returned years later to find nothing, just overgrown grass and broken walls. Europe became a patchwork of ghosts. And yet, amid all this, tiny acts of love persisted. Monks who refused to flee continued to care for the sick. Neighbors left bread outside doors, too afraid to knock. Some buried strangers when no one else would. There's one story from England of a gravedigger who buried his entire village by himself, day after day, until he finally lay down beside them. He wasn't a hero, just a man doing what needed to be done. And that might be the most human thing of all. By the winter of 1349, entire cities had been hollowed out. Florence, London, Paris, they still existed on the map, but not in spirit. Travelers who entered these places described them as cities of the dead. You could walk for an hour without seeing another living soul. Doors hung open, candles burned out long ago, and the only sound was the faint squeak of wagon wheels and the echo of your own heartbeat. It must have felt like the end of the world, and for millions it was. But history never ends where you think it does. Because from these ruins, these silent, empty streets, something unexpected would soon rise, change. The world that emerged after the plague would not be the same. Society would shift, faith would bend, and the idea of what it meant to live and die would never be simple again. For now, though Europe was still holding its breath, Every city a candle flickering in the dark, waiting for the wind to decide whether it would go out or keep burning. The age of death was not over, but the seeds of rebirth had quietly begun to stir. By the time the plague had swept across Europe, people were running out of explanations and hope. Science, such as it was, had failed them. Medicine couldn't save them. The air still felt heavy and cursed. And so, as it often happens when everything falls apart, people turned to God. The problem was, everyone had a different idea of what God wanted. Some believed the plague was punishment, a divine hammer coming down for the sins of humanity. Too much greed, too much pride, too many taverns, too much laughter, too much everything. In their eyes, the sickness wasn't random. It was judgment. And if the world was being punished, there was only one solution: confess, repent, and suffer before it was too late. That's how the flagellants were born. They started as small groups, maybe a dozen people at first, walking barefoot through the streets. They wore plain robes, sometimes white, sometimes blood red, marked with crosses. Each carried a whip, and they didn't just hold them for show. They marched from town to town, singing hymns in deep, echoing voices, and when they stopped, they stripped to the waist and beat themselves bloody. The sound of leather on skin echoed through the squares. The crowd watched in silence, a mixture of horror, pity, and maybe a little hope. Because if these people were willing to suffer for everyone's sins, maybe God would finally listen. To modern ears, it sounds extreme. But in a world that had lost half its people, extreme was the new normal. One German monk described watching hundreds of flagellants enter his town, men and women both moving in a solemn line, chanting as they walked. He said, they beat themselves until the blood ran down to their heels, and they cried out to heaven for mercy. And the strange thing, people found it comforting. There was order in it, rhythm, ritual, something to do in a world that had gone silent. In many cities, the flagellants were welcomed like prophets. Crowds followed them, singing the same songs, some joining in the whipping. They believed their pain could purify the world, but not everyone was convinced. Priests grew uneasy. The Pope, in Avignon, still sitting between his two protective fires, watched these movements spread across Europe and decided things were getting out of hand. By 1349, he officially condemned the flagellants, fearing they'd turn into a cult. And honestly, he wasn't wrong. Some groups began claiming direct messages from God, visions, prophecies, warnings that the world would end in 33 days or 33 months, depending on who you asked. Religious enthusiasm had crossed the line into frenzy. Still, for a time, they kept marching. In Germany, in the Low Countries, in parts of France, waves of people moving from city to city, barefoot, bleeding, praying. They refused shelter, refused money, and never stayed longer than a night. They believed the road itself was holy, that suffering together was the only way to heal the earth. They would enter a town, gather in the square, and begin their ritual. First a hymn, then confession, then the whips. And when the blood began to fall on the dust, people knelt and wept. Some say it was the first time since the plague began that anyone had wept out of hope instead of fear. But like all human things, hope has a dark twin. The longer the plague lasted, the more desperate people became to assign blame. And soon, the whispers began again that the sickness wasn't divine punishment at all, but the work of someone, foreigners, outsiders, neighbors who looked different. In many cities, terrible violence followed pogroms against Jewish communities, accused falsely of poisoning wells. Entire families were burned alive based on rumor and fear. It's one of the ugliest truths of that time, that in their panic, people didn't just fight death, they turned on the living, and the flagellants, with all their zeal, often made things worse. Their sermons about sin and cleansing fed the hysteria. When crowds saw them weeping and bleeding in the streets, it convinced many that divine anger was truly upon them and that someone must be to blame. In trying to save the world, they helped it tear itself apart. Still, not all of it was madness. There was something deeply human buried beneath the frenzy, a need for meaning. When you watch your world crumble, you want to believe it means something, that your suffering matters, that you can do something, anything, to make it stop. And if that means bleeding in the streets, maybe it's worth it. There's a haunting beauty in the image of those processions, hundreds of pale figures under grey skies, their voices rising and falling in unison, a river of humanity trying to purify itself. They carried banners painted with skulls and crosses, sang hymns older than memory, and vanished as quickly as they appeared. Sometimes they left behind miracles, or at least the hope of miracles. A few towns claimed that after the flagellants passed through, the sickness seemed to slow. Whether that was true or not, no one knew. But in those days, even a rumor of hope was a precious thing, and yet there was irony in all of it. The very people trying to avoid death often carried it with them. Every time the flagellants gathered, they spread the plague further. Their processions were perfect vehicles for infection, crowded, sweaty, loud, and very unhygienic. So, as they whipped and prayed their way across Europe, the disease followed right behind them, quietly amused, perhaps, at the effort. History has a dark sense of humor that way. By the early 1350s, the movement began to fade. The Pope's condemnations, the growing suspicion of local authorities, and the simple exhaustion of endless grief finally slowed the processions. Some returned to their homes, those who still had homes, anyway. Others disappeared completely, wandering off into the forests and hills, believing the world was truly ending. And in a way, it had ended, not physically, but spiritually. The old faith that the world made sense, that suffering had reason, that God's plan was orderly and fair, all of that had cracked. Europe's soul had been shaken. The flagellants had tried to repair it with blood, but the wound was deeper than anyone could reach. Still, when you think about them, those strange bleeding pilgrims moving through the rain, it's hard not to feel something for them. They weren't villains or fools. They were people trying to make sense of the senseless. And that's really what all of history is, isn't it? A long, desperate attempt to turn chaos into meaning. The plague had shown them that life was fragile, unpredictable, and cruel. But it had also shown them that faith, in any form, even the wild kind, was a way to keep walking through the dark. And walk they did, through cities that had forgotten their own names, under skies that smelled of smoke and sorrow, carrying torches of belief that refused to go out. Their footsteps fade now, centuries later, but somewhere you can almost still hear the echo, the soft rhythm of penance in a dying world. By the time the plague reached its full strength, even the doctors, the men who were supposed to keep people alive, started quietly packing their bags. You can't really blame them. Imagine trying to fight something you can't see, can't stop, and don't understand. Every cure you try just makes people die faster. That's not medicine anymore. That's guessing with a side of panic. Back then, doctors didn't have microscopes or vaccines, or even a clue what germs were. They had theories. Big fancy theories that sounded smart until you realized most of them came from books written hundreds of years before. According to one of those theories, bad smells, miasmas, caused disease. So if something stank, it was dangerous. And if you wanted to stay healthy, you had to make things smell less bad. Which is how we ended up with one of the strangest sights in history. Doctors wandering the streets wearing bird masks. Not fun bird masks either. These things had long curved beaks stuffed with herbs, flowers, and vinegar-soaked sponges. Supposedly, the good smells would filter out the bad air. Picture that for a second. You're lying in bed, sweating and shaking, and a tall figure in black leather leans over you, breathing heavily through a beak full of lavender. He holds a stick, not to help you, but to poke you from a safe distance. Somewhere in the room, a candle flickers. Yeah, not exactly comforting bedside manners. The people called them plague doctors, though most of them weren't really doctors at all. They were desperate men who agreed to take the job because no one else wanted it. Town councils hired them like you'd hire a plumber, except this plumber might die fixing your leak. Some were brave, some were foolish, most were both. A few actually tried to help. They bled patients, thinking that letting out bad blood would restore balance to the body. Others applied leeches or made strange potions out of vinegar, garlic, or, I wish I was joking, crushed emeralds. There were even recipes that called for mixing ground up toads with wine. People drank it because, well, everyone else was dying. Then there were the doctors who didn't bother pretending anymore. One diary from the time described a physician who would enter a patient's house, glance at the sick person, and immediately walk out again. He'd leave a note that simply said, "Pray." Some doctors did try to keep up appearances. They'd write thick books full of advice, like, avoid sadness, don't eat fruit, don't look at the sick. Great advice. Unless, of course, you were already coughing up blood. Others gave up entirely. They fled cities under the cover of night, leaving behind signs on their doors that said things like, "Gone to the countryside. Do not enter." In Florence, one doctor's journal reads, "I have never seen so many corpses, nor felt so useless. Every remedy fails. Every cure is death." Imagine being trained your whole life to heal people, and suddenly realizing you can help anyone. That has to break something inside you. Hospitals were overflowing. Some doctors stopped recording patients altogether because there was no point by the time they finished writing a name. That person was gone. Nurses refused to enter plague wards. Medical apprentices, the young ones, often died first. They were the ones doing the dirty work, carrying bodies, cleaning sores, or trying to spoon medicine into mouths that couldn't swallow anymore. And because humans are humans, a few saw opportunity in the chaos. Fake doctors appeared everywhere. They sold charms, powders, and miracle tonics with names like the Black Death Defender. These cures usually contained wine, honey, and sometimes mercury. Spoiler, mercury kills you faster than the plague. There's one story of a doctor in Paris who claimed he had found a cure. He said it came to him in a dream. Always a good sign, right? He mixed spices, vinegar, and some secret ingredient and gave it to hundreds of people. Almost all of them died within days. When asked what the secret ingredient was, he replied, "Ground pearls." That's right, crushed jewelry. At this point, even the church doctors, the ones who believed faith could heal, started losing hope. Priests and physicians argued about whether the plague was divine punishment or just bad luck. Either way, nothing worked. In one small town in Italy, the local doctor supposedly nailed a sign to his office door that said, "Closed. The Lord does not pay consulting fees." A little dark humor never hurt. Well, maybe it did, but what else could he do? People started turning to anything that gave them a sense of control. They burned sweet herbs in their homes, wore charms made of silver crosses or dried frogs, or tied garlic around their necks. Some doctors encouraged this, thinking it might help. Others just nodded politely, knowing it wouldn't. By the late months of the outbreak, there were fewer and fewer doctors left. Many had died treating patients. The ones who survived often disappeared into the countryside, claiming they were studying fresh air therapy. Really, they were just hiding, and who could blame them? Imagine standing in a city square surrounded by the sound of weeping and coughing. You've seen more death in 1 week than most people see in a lifetime. The air stinks of decay. Your mask is soaked with sweat. Every time you take it off to drink water, you wonder if that's the moment it gets you. So they gave up. Not out of laziness, but out of exhaustion, body and soul. Some went mad. Others wrote their last notes in trembling Latin. The pestilence spares no one. After that, it was every person for themselves. Families learned to tend to their own sick. Gravediggers became the new doctors, priests the new comforters, and survival the only prescription. When the doctors stopped believing in cures, the people stopped too. And once that happened, something in Europe shifted. The trust between people and science, what little existed back then, cracked. From that crack, a new kind of fear was born. Not just fear of dying, but fear that maybe the world had no one left who could save it. The plague, it seemed, had claimed not only the living, but hope itself. Fear has a strange way of moving. It doesn't just stay inside you, it fills the space around you. In the days of the forgotten plague, fear was everywhere. It hung in the air thicker than smoke, clinging to walls, seeping under doors, whispering through keyholes. People didn't need to see the sickness anymore. They could feel it. A sudden cough in the distance could freeze a whole street. A sneeze might clear a market faster than fire. Nobody wanted to breathe too deeply, talk too loudly, or even pray too close to someone else. Even animals seemed to sense something was wrong. Dogs barked through the night. Horses refused to move down certain streets. Cats, clever as ever, vanished first. Maybe they knew something humans didn't. In some towns, silence replaced everything. The usual noises of life, hammers in workshops, children playing, church bells calling for mass, were gone. Only one sound remained, the slow, steady toll of the death bell. 1 toll meant a death. 10 meant a neighborhood. 100. Well, that meant a town was dying. In London, people said the bells never stopped. They rang so often that the ropes wore thin and had to be replaced. The sound didn't just announce death. It became a kind of background music for the living. A grim lullaby that said, "You're still here, but for how long?" Fear even changed how people smelled. The air was heavy with vinegar, smoke, and herbs. Everyone walked around carrying little pouches filled with flowers or spices, called posies. The rhyme you might know, "Ring around the rosy," came from this very habit. People thought the flowers would protect them from the bad air. Spoiler, they didn't. But it made people feel less helpless. Others burned anything that smelled strong enough to fight the stench. Pine, rosemary, pitch, even leather. Imagine walking through a street where every door has a fire blazing out front, thick black smoke twisting into the sky. It looked like the whole city was trying to exorcise a ghost, and maybe, in a way, it was inside houses. The atmosphere wasn't much better. Families locked themselves in, sealing windows with waxed cloth and covering door cracks with mud. They didn't know what caused the plague, but they knew it came from outside. Some people wouldn't even speak above a whisper, afraid that sound might carry the disease. One letter from a woman in France described how her husband refused to kiss her for 6 months, even though they lived in the same house. She wrote, "He loves me still, but only from the other side of the room." Fear made everyone a stranger. When a person died, their body wasn't washed or dressed anymore. No one wanted to touch them. Instead, they were wrapped in sheets and dragged to the door, where men in cloaks, the death collectors, would come at night with carts. The sound of those wooden wheels rolling over cobblestones became the new heartbeat of every city. Sometimes, people would wake in the middle of the night, thinking they heard the cart outside their house, and just lie still, pretending not to breathe, as if the plague could forget about them if they were quiet enough. Doctors, priests, and even gravediggers began wearing amulets, carrying crosses, or muttering protective prayers. They didn't really believe it would save them, but they needed something to hold on to. In many cities, the smell of death became unbearable. To fight it, people started carrying oranges stuffed with cloves. Others wore long robes soaked in vinegar. A few even walked around with sponges pressed to their faces, dripping wine down their chins. Not the worst way to go, honestly. And then came the paranoia. People began to believe the plague wasn't natural, that someone had caused it. Rumors spread like fire. Foreigners had poisoned the wells, witches had cursed the land, or even that invisible plague spreaders were sprinkling powder in the streets. In some towns, frightened mobs attacked anyone they didn't recognize. A stranger could walk into a village and never walk out again. But the truth was far simpler and far crueler. It wasn't magic. It wasn't poison. It was life and death, tangled together in a way no one yet understood. The rats came first, their tiny bodies slipping through cracks in walls and barrels. Then came the fleas. You couldn't see them, but you could feel them. Tiny, hungry bites that itched for a moment, and then nothing, until days later, when the fever hit. By then, it was too late. Every street, every house, every ship carried the same quiet question: who will be next? Some people tried to escape to the countryside, hoping that clean air and open fields would save them. But even there, the fear followed. Villages locked their gates to travelers. Some even posted guards with spears, warning outsiders to stay away or be shot. It was the kind of fear that didn't just destroy lives. It broke the idea of community. People stopped trusting one another. The baker wouldn't hand you bread. The priest wouldn't bless your home. The doctor wouldn't knock on your door. In Venice, an eyewitness wrote, "The sick die alone, the living live like ghosts." And yet, strangely, fear made people creative. They built quarantine houses for the sick, the first of their kind. Ships arriving at port had to wait 40 days before anyone could step off. 40 giorni, 40 days gave us the word quarantine. The first time someone said, "You can't come in yet," they probably had no idea they were inventing one of the most important health rules in history. But in the middle of the plague, rules didn't always matter. Fear doesn't follow logic. At night, when the fires burned low and the bells finally went quiet, the world felt empty. The moon rose over silent towns, shining down on deserted streets where only cats and rats dared to roam. Sometimes, people said they could hear whispers, not from ghosts, but from the wind itself. Words like mercy, forgive, or why. Nobody ever answered them. Fear had become its own kind of plague. It spread faster than disease, lived longer than bodies, and touched everyone, even those who somehow managed to survive. And as the long dark nights stretched on, one thing became clear. The real enemy wasn't just the sickness in the blood, it was the sickness in the heart. Because once people gave in to fear, truly gave in, the plague didn't even need to kill them. they were already gone. If there's one thing humans are good at, it's trying something even when we have absolutely no idea what we're doing. And during the Forgotten Plague, something became the national treatment plan. Doctors, healers, monks, and even random neighbors all had a theory about how to survive. Most of them started with confidence and ended in disaster. You could say that back then, medicine was about 10% knowledge and 90% enthusiasm. Let's start with the most popular cure: bloodletting. The idea was simple. If you're sick, something bad must be in your blood. So, just let the bad stuff out. Easy, right? Doctors would cut open a vein or use leeches to suck out the illness. People lay there, dizzy and pale, watching their life literally drain away while the doctor proudly announced, "Ah, yes, you're healing nicely." Spoiler, they weren't. In reality, bloodletting made things much worse. It left people weak, dehydrated, and unable to fight the infection. But because the patients usually died anyway, no one could tell whether it was the plague or the cure that finished them off. Then there were the herbal cures. Everyone had a favorite recipe: boil sage with vinegar, drink it while reciting a prayer, and sleep with onions under your pillow. If that didn't work, try garlic mixed with wine or maybe powdered emeralds. If you were feeling fancy and didn't mind swallowing jewelry, monks brewed their own tonics too, using whatever they had in the garden. Rosemary, thyme, and something called dragon's blood, which sounded impressive until you realized it was just red tree sap. People still swore by it. After all, when your neighbors are dropping like flies, a potion that might work feels better than doing nothing. Another treatment was heat therapy. The theory went like this: the plague was caused by cold, damp air, so the cure must be warmth. Some people sat by roaring fires all day, sweating until they fainted. Others covered themselves with blankets and lit candles all around the bed. One man in Italy tried to bake the plague out of his body by sleeping next to a brick oven. It worked if you count dying of heatstroke as success. And then there were the smells. Everyone was obsessed with smells. Since they believed bad air caused disease, they figured good smells could cure it. So people filled their homes with herbs, spices, and perfumes. One London doctor swore that the smell of roses could protect you. He told his patients to sniff a fresh rose every morning. Unfortunately, roses wilt faster than hope, and when the doctor himself got the plague, people whispered that maybe he should have used a different flower. Others went the opposite direction. They thought strong, nasty smells might scare the disease away. So they burned tar, leather, and even piles of manure. Imagine that, a city trying to smell worse on purpose. If the plague didn't kill you, the stench might be. Richer families hired fumigators to walk through their houses waving pans of burning herbs. These men were basically human air fresheners in capes. They'd cough their lungs out in the smoke and declare, "All safe now," before running to the next job. Of course, none of it worked. But the effort gave people something to believe in. And when you're surrounded by death, belief can feel like medicine. Then came the more creative cures. Some people tried toad therapy. The idea was that toads could suck out poison through the skin. They'd place a live toad on a boil and wait for it to die because apparently a dead toad meant the cure was working. Others went one step further. They'd dry the toad, grind it into powder, and wear it in a pouch around their necks. Nothing says I value my health like powdered amphibian jewelry. There was also urine therapies, exactly what it sounds like. People drank it, bathed in it, or washed their sores with it, believing it purified the body. It did not. It did, however, make everyone smell like a public latrine. And let's not forget the religious cures. Monks recommended fasting, prayer, and repentance. Pilgrims crawled on their knees for miles, whipping themselves bloody in the streets, convinced that suffering would earn forgiveness and, maybe, mercy. Crowds followed them, chanting and sobbing, as if the world could be cleansed by tears. Meanwhile, the plague went on, unmoved. There was one cure that almost made sense, though quarantine. Some doctors noticed that separating the sick from the healthy actually helped. The word came from Quaranta, journey 40 days. Ships arriving in Venice had to wait that long before unloading passengers or goods. It wasn't perfect, but it slowed the spread. For once, someone's wild idea actually worked. Still, for every good idea, there were 10 terrible ones. People rubbed themselves with mercury ointments, drank liquid gold, or even inhaled crushed gemstones. A few believed sitting in the sewer might help balance the body as humors, because nothing says health like breathing in human waste. And of course, when all else failed, there was superstition. People hung herbs from their doors, drew chalk crosses on their walls, and whispered charms before bed. Some tied frogs, lizards, or scorpions to their wrists, hoping the plague would attack the animal instead. Others slept with their shoes on just, in case they had to run from death in the middle of the night. The strangest part, sometimes someone did recover. Not often, but often enough to keep hope alive. When that happened, everyone scrambled to copy whatever that person did, ate, drank, prayed, or wore. If a man survived after eating 10 cloves of garlic, soon the whole town smelled like an Italian kitchen. But most cures led to the same quiet end. A house sealed shut, a cough that turned into silence, another cart rolling down the street before dawn. The plague was unbeatable, but people kept trying anyway, because what else could they do? Hope, no matter how foolish, was its own kind of medicine. And so the towns kept burning herbs, swallowing emerald dust, and praying between coughs. They'd whisper to each other, "This one will work. This time we'll live." But deep down, they knew what was coming. The forgotten plague didn't care how clever your doctor was or how expensive your perfume smelled. It came for everyone, rich or poor, learned or lost. And as the smoke curled above the rooftops and the last of the toads croaked their final protest, Europe realized a bitter truth. The cure was often worse than the disease. By the time the plague reached its peak, cities across Europe began to look less like homes and more like graveyards. Streets that once echoed with laughter and trade now whispered with the wind. Doors stood open where no one lived anymore. The air carried a smell that never quite left. Smoke, rot, and something bitter, like the ghost of fear itself. It's strange to think about. Some of the greatest cities in history, Florence, Venice, London, Paris, all brought to their knees by something smaller than the eye could see. Let's take Florence, for example. Before the plague, it was one of the most beautiful cities in Europe, alive with art, music, and money. Then, almost overnight, the laughter stopped. The poet Giovanni Boccaccio wrote that people died as if struck down by an invisible bolt. The wealthy fled to their country villas. The poor were left behind, and soon the streets were filled with carts carrying bodies instead of bread. In Venice, the canals grew quiet. The singing gondoliers vanished. The famous markets shut down. Ships were forbidden to dock, their sails flapping uselessly in the harbor. The city that once smelled of salt and spice now reeked of smoke and sickness. Even the pigeons left St. Mark's Square. And you know things are bad when the pigeons give up on free food. Some people thought cities themselves had become cursed. They said the very walls were sick, that the stones had soaked up too much death. So they fled. Entire families packed what little they could carry and vanished into the countryside. Those who stayed behind did so because they had nowhere else to go. But the countryside wasn't always the safe haven they imagined. Villagers barred their gates, shouting, "Go back. You'll bring it here." Strangers were treated like criminals. Travelers found themselves sleeping in fields, hiding under trees, listening to wolves howl in the distance. Back in the cities, the ones left behind learned to live among the dead. Graveyards overflowed, so people started burying bodies in church courtyards, basements, even gardens. In some places, there were so many corpses that gravediggers simply stopped digging. They depiled bodies into pits and covered them with thin layers of dirt, barely enough to hide what lay beneath. The smell, it's hard to even imagine. Chroniclers described it as sweet and foul, like fruit left too long in the sun. People walked around holding flowers to their noses or cloths soaked in vinegar. Some claimed they could taste death on their tongues. Animals took over the cities. Dogs roamed in packs, scavenging for food. Rats scurried boldly through doorways, unbothered by the humans who once chased them. In one town in France, goats grazed in the main square. In another, a horse was found wandering inside a church, chewing on altar cloths. And still, the silence hung heavy. In London, one writer described walking through the city and hearing nothing but the creak of a hanging sign. No bells, no carts, no cries. He wrote, only wind. There's something deeply haunting about that kind of quiet. It's not peace, it's absence. The kind that presses against your chest and makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. Whole neighborhoods became ghost towns. Windows shattered, weeds grew through cobblestones, and letters sat unopened on tables covered in dust. Imagine walking into a house and finding dinner still on the table, a chair pushed back as if someone had just stood up and never came back. In some places, people believed that evil spirits had taken over the empty houses. They said you could hear whispers if you listened at night, voices of the dead calling your name, asking for company. Whether that was true or just the imagination of frightened survivors, no one wanted to find out. Even cities that tried to hold on eventually gave in. Paris set up quarantine zones, building walls around infected districts. The plan worked, sort of. The problem was, they never decided what to do with the people inside the walls, so those districts became death traps. No one in, no one out. When the guards finally opened the gates weeks later, they found silence. But here's the thing about cities, they don't die easily. After a while, months, sometimes years, people started trickling back. Farmers brought in food, merchants opened stalls, and the sound of hammers returned as buildings were repaired. But things weren't the same. Streets felt wider, emptier. There were too many missing faces. In London, one survivor wrote, "The city breathes again, but with half a heart. Life resumed, but cautiously. People greeted each other from a distance. Churches reopened, but pews remained half empty. Children played, but parents watched them with quiet dread. Every cough made heads turn. Every cold wind felt like a warning. And in the ruins, something new took root: resilience. The survivors, those who had seen the worst of it, learned how to start over. They cleaned the streets, burned the infected homes, planted gardens where mass graves once lay. Slowly, color returned to the world. The green of vines, the blue of laundry hanging in the sun, the yellow of bread fresh from the oven. But the memory lingered. People spoke in whispers about the year of death. No one wanted to remember, yet no one could forget. The plague had changed them. It had stripped life down to its bare bones. What mattered and what didn't. Maybe that's why, even in those silent cities, some people found a strange kind of peace. With the noise gone, they could finally see what remained. The sky, the wind, the sound of their own heartbeat. And so the abandoned cities began to breathe again. Not as they were, but as something different, quieter, sadder, wiser. The forgotten plague had taken so much, but somehow it had left behind the faintest whisper of hope. Because if a city can die and come back to life, maybe people can too. When the worst had passed and the world began to stir again, something unexpected happened. Children started to appear from the ruins. Little faces, thin and pale, peeking from behind half-broken doors, or wandering alone down streets that used to be full of life. These were the children who survived. Some had been hidden away by parents who never made it. Some were orphans taken in by strangers, and others, somehow, had managed to survive on their own, clever, quiet, and haunted beyond their years. Imagine a child of 8, standing in the middle of a city square, clutching a wooden toy with no one left to play with. The echoes of laughter still hung in the air, but the voices that made them were long gone. In places like Florence and Avignon, priests found groups of children living together in abandoned houses, scavenging for food, lighting fires from broken furniture, keeping watch at night like little soldiers. They were called the plague orphans. Some were adopted into new families. Others disappeared into the streets, growing up to become thieves, beggars, or worse. But not all of their stories were sad. Some of those children went on to rebuild what their parents had lost. They grew up to be the new generation, the ones who remembered enough to fear the past, but not so much that they stopped moving forward. There are records from England describing a strange kind of school that appeared after the plague. One old man, the only surviving teacher in his village, gathered the orphans and taught them how to read using bits of parchment and charcoal. They met in a barn, with hay for chairs and broken tiles for writing boards. He called them his little flock. It's said that, years later, one of those children became a scholar who wrote the first proper medical account of the plague, trying to understand what had killed their parents. In another story, from Germany, a boy named Hans survived by hiding in a bell tower. When it was over, he climbed down and rang the bell every evening for years, just so the town wouldn't forget the silence that had come before. And yet, despite everything, children still found ways to laugh. Travelers wrote about seeing them play among the ruins, chasing each other through the empty streets, pretending to be knights or merchants or kings. One woman in Venice said she watched a group of children pretending the plague had never happened at all, acting out weddings and festivals with dolls made from rags. It's strange, isn't it? Even after the world fell apart, the sound of children's laughter came back first. But those who survived carried something invisible with them. They had seen too much. The drawings some left behind, crude sketches on parchment or wood, show houses with no roofs, people lying down, and dark shapes in the sky. Some historians think they were trying to draw what they thought death looked like. As they grew up, these children became the backbone of a changed Europe. Fewer people meant more land, more food, and strangely, more opportunity. The old feudal systems began to shift. Wages rose because there were fewer workers. Peasants started demanding fair treatment. The world that had once seemed fixed, the powerful at the top, the poor at the bottom, began to tilt. In that way, the children who survived didn't just live through history. They changed it, but that didn't erase the scars. Some survivors grew fearful of crowds. Others refused to ever return to cities. In letters written decades later, they still spoke of nightmares, dreams of dark air, empty streets, and knocking on doors that never opened. One monk, who had been a child during the outbreak, wrote, "When the wind blows at night, I still hear them, the bells, the crying. I know they're not real, but I hear them." For many, faith became their comfort. They built small shrines where they buried their families, lighting candles each year on the same day the plague had arrived. In time, these became quiet pilgrimages, not grand ones like those to Rome or Canterbury, but small walks of remembrance, a son placing flowers by a tree, a woman leaving bread by a ruined wall. And yet, even through the grief, something beautiful grew: compassion. Those who had survived as children had learned, painfully, how fragile everything could be. They grew into adults who valued kindness more than gold. They built hospitals, orphanages, and new laws to protect the poor. Towns that once shut their gates began opening them to travelers and strangers again. It's as if the world had been reminded of how precious life was, and that reminder came from the youngest of them all. In some parts of Europe, people began saying that children were closer to God because they had looked death in the face and kept walking. Priests started calling them the small saints of the plague years. Whether that's true or not, one thing is certain: they kept the world going when everyone else had stopped. When the cities finally began to rebuild, it was those children, now older, stronger, and determined, who planted the first seeds, painted the first walls, and opened the first markets. Their laughter returned to the streets, softer this time, but still there. And that laughter, that sound of survival, became the heartbeat of a new age. Maybe that's the quiet miracle hidden inside the tragedy of the forgotten plague, that even when everything else crumbled, hope survived in the smallest hands. Because sometimes, when the world burns down, it's the children who gather the ashes and start to build again. Not everyone ran when the plague came, some stayed. And among those who stayed, many wore the simple robes of priests. In the worst years of the plague, when even doctors locked their doors, the priests were often the last ones walking the streets, soft-voiced, lantern in hand, carrying both a Bible and a small vial of holy water. They went where no one else dared to go, into the homes of the sick, the dying, and the already dead. It's said that in Florence, the church bells rang so often for funerals that the ropes frayed and snapped. The priests who rang them kept going until their hands bled. Some people cursed them. "Where is your God now?" they shouted. Others clung to them like lifelines, begging for blessings, forgiveness, or just someone to listen. And still, the priests came not because they had answers, but because they couldn't leave. Imagine walking down a narrow medieval street at night, the air heavy, the sky dark. A single figure moves through the mist, carrying a small cross. He stops at a door marked with a painted red X, whispers a prayer, and goes inside. He knows he may never come out again. That was courage, or faith, maybe both. Of course, not every priest was a saint. Some fled as fast as they could, packing their things and disappearing to the countryside. The church lost thousands of its servants to fear and sickness alike. There are stories of whole monasteries where only one or two brothers survived, tending to the others until they, too, fell silent. In one abbey in England, the last monk alive kept writing the names of the dead in the monastery register. The last entry simply reads, "And now I, too, must stop." But for everyone who ran, another stayed, and their quiet acts of courage left deep marks. In Avignon, where the Pope himself had taken refuge, priests worked around the clock to bury the dead in mass graves. They blessed the pits, one after another, whispering prayers until their voices broke. Some historians say that's where the phrase "rest in peace" became common. It was easier to say those 3 words than a full funeral, right when thousands were dying every week. The problem was, the priests began to die too. Without enough clergy left, the church started letting anyone with a clean conscience perform last rites, even ordinary villagers. For the first time, holiness became a matter of heart, not title. And that quietly changed everything. Faith itself began to shift. People still prayed, but their prayers sounded different now. Less about miracles, more about mercy. One chronicler wrote, "We no longer ask for life without pain, but for the courage to endure it." It's a haunting line, but it shows how much people changed. Before the plague, religion had been something distant, almost ceremonial. Afterward, it became something raw and personal, a conversation with the heavens whispered in the dark. The priests who survived were never the same either. Some said they had seen too much death to believe as they once did. Others said the opposite, that they'd seen too much death not to believe. In a small village in France, there was a priest named Father René. When the plague hit, almost everyone fled, but he stayed behind. He spent his days ringing the bell, tending the sick, and burying the dead. When it was over, the few survivors begged him to leave, to rest, to start fresh somewhere else. But he refused. He rebuilt his church from the stones of the ruined houses around it. When asked why, he said, "If death can stay here, so can I." He never left that village again. Stories like his spread across Europe, whispered from town to town, reminders that even in the darkest times, someone had stayed to light a candle. Still, faith was wounded. Many began to question the church itself. How could such suffering happen if the world was watched over by a loving God? Why did prayers go unanswered? Why did good priests die while greedy lords survived? These questions didn't vanish after the plague. They grew. Over the next century, they would spark something much bigger. Reformations, revolutions, and a new way of thinking about faith and power. But for now, in the quiet years after the worst of it, people just tried to make peace with what they'd seen. Small chapels appeared in the countryside, built not for glory, but for memory. The walls were simple, the crosses made of rough wood. Inside, you'd find candles, offerings of bread or flowers, and sometimes a child's toy left behind for a lost soul. At night, survivors gathered there, not for long sermons, but to sit together in silence. Some prayed, some cried, and some just listened to the wind through the cracks in the stone. It was said that in those moments, when the world was still and hearts were heavy, you could almost feel the presence of those priests who never came back, their voices carried in the flicker of the flame, their faith still holding the darkness at bay. Even centuries later, travelers wrote about villages where the locals claimed to see the walking priest. On foggy nights, a ghostly figure moving from door to door, blessing the sleeping houses. Most shrugged it off as superstition, but others swore that, when the wind was right, they heard him whisper, "You're not alone." And maybe that's what the priests who stayed behind gave the world. More than anything else, not miracles, not answers, but that small, sacred reminder, you're not alone. Because sometimes, faith isn't about being saved. It's about standing in the middle of fear, and staying anyway. If there was one group of people who saw the plague more closely than anyone else, it was the gravediggers. The priests prayed for the dead. The doctors tried to save them, but the gravediggers, they were the ones who cleaned up what was left behind. Their job was simple and horrifying. Dig, carry, bury, repeat. They worked day and night, often for no pay. Sometimes they were promised gold, land, or forgiveness of sins. But most of them just wanted to eat and to stay alive long enough to spend whatever coins they made. Imagine this, the ground frozen in winter, your hands blistered, your nose filled with the stench of rot, and behind you, a line of carts waiting with more bodies than you can count. And every time you finish one pit, someone calls out another's coming. That was the rhythm of their lives. Many were criminals, outcasts, or men who had nothing left to lose. Cities like London and Paris hired them by the dozens. They'd walk through the streets at night, pushing heavy wooden carts, calling out the same grim phrase over and over, "Bring out your dead." People learned to dread those words. The sound of wheels on cobblestones, the slow knock on a door, the thud of another body added to the pile. And yet, strangely, the gravediggers became something like folk heroes, the ones who didn't run, the ones who kept the world from drowning in death. They were rough men, full of dark jokes and strange wisdom, Humor was their only armor. One chronicler from Italy wrote that he once asked a gravedigger if he feared catching the plague. The man just laughed and said, "I'll be digging my own hole soon anyway. Might as well make it a nice one." That kind of humor, dry, morbid, and a little brave, kept them sane. But not all of them were careless. Some took pride in their grim duty. In England, a man named Thomas of York was said to bless every body before lowering it into the ground. "They deserve a little respect," he said, "even if no one else remembers their names." It's so strange to think about that in a time when people feared touching even their loved ones, these men handled the dead every single day. No gloves, no masks, just rags wrapped around their faces and a strong stomach. And they sang. Oh yes, they sang. It sounds unbelievable, but many accounts mention the gravediggers' songs, rough, weary tunes that echoed through the streets at night. Some were prayers, others were jokes set to melody. One popular song went something like, "Dig deep, dig fast, no need to cry. We'll all lie down before July." Dark humor at its finest. But in a strange way, those songs gave people comfort. They reminded everyone that life still existed, even in the middle of death. When villagers heard the gravediggers humming in the distance, they'd whisper, "The world still moves." Of course, the work broke many of them. The endless repetition, the smell, the sight of small bodies among the larger ones. There are records of gravediggers who simply walked into their own pits one day and never came out. One French record tells of a man named Etienne who buried his entire village by himself. When rescuers arrived weeks later, they found him sitting beside the last grave, his shovel stuck in the earth, staring at nothing. He had finished his job, and he never spoke again. In cities like Florence, when there were too few gravediggers left, prisoners were offered freedom in exchange for digging graves. Most didn't live long enough to enjoy it, but those who did became local legends. People would whisper, "That man wrestled death and won." And when the plague finally loosened its grip, it was the gravediggers who cleaned up what remained, clearing the bones, covering the mass graves, planting grass over the fields of death. They gave the dead their last bit of dignity. Even long after the plague ended, people remembered them. Some churches built small statues of faceless men with shovels, tucked quietly into the corners of cemeteries. Not saints, exactly, but close enough. And then there's the folklore. In some parts of Germany, people told stories about the midnight diggers, ghosts of plague, gravediggers who returned to finish work left undone. They said if you heard the sound of a shovel scraping earth at night, it meant another death was coming. But in other places, like Spain, the legend was gentler. They said the spirits of good gravediggers stayed behind to protect travelers, guiding them through fog or keeping wild animals away. Death, after all, had been their companion, and they had learned how to live with it. That's what makes their story so strangely moving. The gravediggers weren't heroes in shining armor. They weren't noble or holy. They were tired, smelly, half-starved people, doing a terrible job because someone had to. And yet, in doing that job, they kept the living world from collapsing. There's a kind of rough grace in that. They didn't fight death, they accepted it, faced it, and shoveled it, one pit at a time. And maybe that's what the rest of the world needed most. A reminder that sometimes, the only way through horror is to keep digging, to keep moving. There's a saying that appeared after the plague. No one knows who first said it, but it spread across Europe like a quiet proverb. He who digs graves for others learns the shape of life. Maybe the gravediggers understood something the rest of us don't. That death, as awful as it is, also teaches us how to value the simple act of breathing, of standing in the sun, of waking up one more day. So the next time you walk past an old cemetery and hear the wind whistle through the grass, maybe pause for a second, because somewhere, centuries ago, a tired man with a shovel stood in that same spot and gave the world a little more room to live. When the dust finally began to settle and the grave bells stopped ringing, something unexpected drifted through the silence. Music, soft at first, uncertain, a hum in a tavern corner, a flute played by a shepherd, a woman singing to a child who didn't understand why everyone else was gone. It was as if the world, after holding its breath for years, had decided to exhale again. Across Europe, the survivors started to sing, not to celebrate, but to remember. Their songs carried sorrow, yes, but also a quiet sort of defiance, a way of saying, we're still here. Some of these songs became famous. You might even know one of them, though you may not realize it. Ring Around the Rosie, For instance, the eerie nursery rhyme still sung by children today. Most historians believe it has roots in the plague years. Ring around the rosy, the red rash that appeared on victims' skin. A pocket full of posies, herbs and flowers people carried to mask the smell of death. Ashes, ashes, the cremation of bodies. We all fall down. Simple, childlike, terrifying, once you know. It's strange how humans turn fear into rhythm, into something we can carry. In Italy, survivors wrote what they called cante di peste, plague songs. They weren't written on fancy parchment or sung in cathedrals. They were rough and raw, sung in the fields and streets. Some begged for mercy. Others joked about death like an old drinking buddy. One went, "Death came knocking at my door. I offered him wine. He asked for more. He drank. He laughed. Then took my wife. Now I drink twice to toast her life." Dark, funny, and heartbreakingly human. In France, ballads told of the years of silence, of lost lovers, vanished towns, and prayers whispered in empty chapels. These songs traveled faster than any letter, passed from mouth to mouth until no one remembered who wrote them. And in Germany, a strange kind of dance appeared. The Totentanz, or Dance of Death. Artists painted it on church walls. Skeletons leading kings, priests, and peasants hand in hand in a long, endless chain. But it wasn't meant to be scary. It was a reminder that in the end, death dances with everyone, rich or poor, strong or weak, and that the only thing to do is to keep moving to the rhythm while you can. People actually danced to those paintings. In market squares and barns, villagers would gather, play drums and fiddles, and move in wide, circling steps. Some said they were mocking death. Others said they were inviting it to dance gently when the time came. And so the dance macabre was born, not just an image, but a kind of spiritual healing. It's beautiful, in a haunting way, that out of so much loss came art. Out of so much silence came song. Even the churches, once filled with mourning, began to echo again with music. Composers like Guillaume de Mouchot, who actually survived the plague, wrote new masses filled with both grief and hope. You can still hear them today, slow, echoing chants that seem to hang between sorrow and peace, as if unsure which side to land on. Poets began writing. In England, William Langland wrote of a field full of folk, all manner of men, haunted by the memory of pestilence. And in Italy, Boccaccio's Decameron, a book of stories told by survivors hiding from the plague, captured the strange truth that laughter can exist even in the shadow of death. That's what these songs and stories really were. Medicine, not for the body, but for the soul. People had seen too much darkness. They needed sound, rhythm, rhyme, the warmth of a shared melody to feel human again. And so, everywhere you went, you'd hear it. A flute in a window, a lute in a courtyard, a mother humming as she baked bread for the first time in years. The songs changed, though before the plague, music had been about joy, love, harvest, celebration. After it, the songs became slower, deeper, filled with the weight of what people had lost. There's one that survives from the 14th century, written by a woman named Agnes de Flandres. The lyrics, roughly translated, go. The fields have grown quiet, the bells no longer cry, but still I dream of faces I could not say goodbye. I plant my heart where the earth is deep and cold, so flowers may grow where sorrow has been told. It's simple, but it captures something timeless, that need to make beauty out of pain. As the years went on, those songs turned into traditions. Folk festivals, processions, memorial days. People sang not because they'd forgotten, but because they wanted to remember together. And maybe that's what saved Europe from falling apart completely. Not medicine, not kings or doctors, but this quiet chorus of survivors singing their way back to life. They didn't sing about victory, they sang about endurance, about planting gardens on graves, about laughter returning to empty rooms, about the strange, stubborn joy of being alive after everything else had fallen silent. When you think about it, that's what all of history's best songs are. Survivors' songs. Not polished, not perfect, just honest sounds from people who've seen the worst and still found a tune to hum. And maybe that's why, even now, centuries later, when someone hums Ring Around the Rosie or an old folk ballad echoes through a festival square, there is still something ancient in it, a faint echo of those long-ago voices who once sang just to prove they hadn't disappeared. They didn't. Their songs are still here. And if you listen closely, really listen, you might just hear them in the wind, humming softly over the fields that once held their bones, the songs of the survivors, the lullabies of a world that refused to stay quiet. By the time the 15th century dawned, the plague had loosened its grip. Towns were rebuilding, fields were green again, and laughter, though quieter than before, was finding its way back into the world. But something had changed forever. Europe had been through a century of ghosts. Even when the sickness faded, its shadow stayed long and heavy, stretching across generations like an old scar that never really healed. They called it the Great Mortality, the Black Death, the punishment of God. But to most people, it was simply the time before and the time after. Before, the world had felt endless. There were rules, hierarchies, certainties. After, everything seemed fragile. Life felt borrowed, temporary, like a candle in a drafty room. And yet, out of that fragility, something new began to grow. In the years after the plague, the land itself changed. Whole villages had vanished, gone so completely that even the maps forgot them. Forests crept back where houses once stood. Wolves roamed near city walls again. But the survivors, they had space now. Fields to farm, houses to claim. For the first time, ordinary peasants could demand better wages, better lives. When lords refused, some just packed up and left. There were fewer people, but more freedom. It was as if the plague had torn down an old world and forced a new one to be built from the rubble. Serfdom, that ancient system of peasants bound to land, began to crumble. People moved to towns, markets grew, new ideas spread faster. The silence left by death made room for invention. It's strange to think that a plague, something so dark, helped set the stage for the Renaissance. But history is full of odd balances like that, isn't it? In art, death stopped being just a skeleton in the corner. Painters started studying the human body, painting it with light and warmth, as if to remind themselves how beautiful life really was. In Florence, frescoes showed angels not as distant spirits, but as people with kind eyes and tired smiles, a reflection of the living trying to understand the divine through loss. In manuscripts, monks sketched little dancing skeletons in the margins, not to frighten, but to laugh, a wink at the inevitability of it all. Still, the fear never completely left. Every time a cough echoed in a market or a rash appeared on someone's skin, people held their breath. For 100 years, outbreaks came and went, smaller waves, like aftershocks from a great earthquake. And every time, people whispered, "It's back." They burned herbs, hung charms, closed city gates. They still didn't fully understand disease, not yet. But the memory of the plague kept them cautious, watchful. In a strange way, that fear became a kind of wisdom, a reminder that control was an illusion, that life could be appended overnight. And maybe that's why the art, the science, and the faith of that era all share the same heartbeat. We could die tomorrow, so what will we make today? Even the way people thought about God began to shift. Before, religion had been about rules and obedience. After, it became more personal, more questioning. If priests could die just like peasants, maybe holiness wasn't about rank. If the world could end without warning, maybe salvation wasn't something you earned, but something you carried quietly inside you. That small spark of doubt, of curiosity, grew into the ideas that would one day fuel the Reformation, the scientific revolution, and the rise of modern thought. The plague didn't just kill millions, it woke something up. But for the common folk, the farmers, bakers, midwives, and shepherds, the change was simpler. They built smaller houses, but sturdier ones. They made room for gardens. They told stories at night, not just about kings or saints, but about the ones who'd survived, the grandmothers who'd kept the children alive, the blacksmith who'd rung the church bell when no one else would. Those quiet acts of endurance became their legends. And maybe that's what truly defines a people. Not what they destroy or conquer, but what they carry through the fire and keep alive afterward. By the late 1400s, a new generation had grown up. They hadn't seen the plague themselves, but they lived among its ghosts. In overgrown graveyards, in empty church pews with names no one remembered, in songs that made no sense anymore, but were still sung. To them, the plague was history, but it lived on in their dreams. You can still see it in the architecture of the time, tall, narrow windows that let in more light, churches painted in colors brighter than before, as if to banish shadows from the walls. Even cities changed. Streets became wider, cleaner, markets more organized. The memory of the plague reshaped how people built their world. It's almost poetic that something invisible could leave a mark so permanent. And yet, despite all the fear and loss, something gentle emerged. A kind of quiet wisdom about life's A monk in Prague once wrote, "The dead teach the living better than the living teach the dead." He wasn't being grim, he meant that through loss, people learn what truly matters. Community, kindness, the warmth of shared bread, a moment of laughter on a day that could have been your last. That lesson, born in the darkest century, still hums beneath the surface of our world today. If you stand in certain places in Europe, you can still feel it. In London's Charterhouse, where monks once buried the plague dead, the air is oddly still. In the countryside of France, where abandoned villages lie under the grass, the wind sounds almost like a sigh. And in Venice, on the island of Poveglia, once a quarantine station, the birds don't sing much. But if you listen long enough, you might catch it. Not silence, exactly, something softer, a hum beneath the quiet. Maybe it's the echo of those who survived. Or maybe it's the earth remembering, because the forgotten plague wasn't really forgotten. It lives in our architecture, our art, our music, and our myths, in every public health law, in every lullaby about ashes and roses, in every time we wash our hands a little more carefully when the world feels uncertain again. So when you hear the phrase "once upon a time," remember, some of those times were very dark, but people still sang, still built, still loved, and somehow, through centuries of shadow, life kept walking forward. The forgotten plague took a century to pass, but its lessons, its ghosts, and its quiet wisdom never really left us. Maybe they never should. And now, as the night deepens and the world outside your window grows still, you can close your eyes and know that even through the darkest of ages, humanity always found a way back to the light. Always. End of the forgotten plague that haunted Europe for a century.